Rishi Sunak has blocked the Scottish Government's gender reform bill. The bill would allow teenagers as young as 16 to legally change their gender and reduces the period for which an applicant must have lived in their acquired gender before submitting an application from 2 years down to 3 months. The government has used Section 35 of the Scotland Act 1998 to block Holyrood's gender recognition reform bill from becoming law, claiming it will have an impact on UK-wide equality legislation. And this is the first time that Section 35 has been used. Prime Minister Nicola Sturgeon has described Westminster's action to block the gender bill as, quote, a full frontal attack on the Scottish Parliament. So here to discuss this with me, the discrimination and employment law barrister Robin Moira White and the family law barrister Sarah Phillimore. Welcome back. Sarah, I'm going to come to you first. There was an article in today's Times, and this is by Ellie Gomersall, and the president of the National Union of Students Scotland. And this is a trans person saying, the gender reform bill is simply going to make life easier for people like me. It means that marriage records, death certificates, all of these things will just be more accurately reflective in terms of how this person lives. What's wrong with that?
The charitable interpretation of that is that it's a fantasy. The accurate interpretation is it is untrue. Now, I accept that in most interactions in life, sex is irrelevant. It's not relevant now as we sit here talking. But we organise society around the protected category of sex because when it matters, it really matters. So a GRC will give a biological male who doesn't have to be, according to Scotland, diagnosed with gender dysphoria, doesn't have to make any modifications to his body whatsoever. The GRC gives him the legal sex female and allows him access into more female spaces. So to say this is simply something that I hold to myself that makes me feel better about myself is not true, because it changes the meaning of sex in the Equality Act. And that was the recent judgment of Lady Haldane, where some commentators said the Equality Act defines sex as purely biological. She said, no, legal sex is included within that definition.
I'm going to come to you, Robin, because the bill itself states that it will have no implications or ramifications on UK-wide equality law. Is that accurate?
Yes, I think it is. We have the situation that Sarah's described already anyway, that there are no particular requirements for a GRC under UK law. You don't have to modify your body. You have to convince a panel that you are sufficiently committed to your affirmed sex. And that doesn't require particular surgery in all cases. So what I think's been lost in the rather soundbite debate that we've had is what the changes in Scotland actually do and the small changes that they make. And I think we've lost the focus on the Equality Act as the gatekeeping act for single-sex spaces and the legitimate concerns that people have about being able to, in certain circumstances, maintain privacy, all of which is maintained by the Equality Act, none of which is changed by the Scottish Act.
So you don't accept the idea that the Scottish Act will effectively change what the Equality Act means when it refers to the protection of sex?
Well, we know that because Lady Haldane's judgment, which Sarah's absolutely correctly referred to, is the judgment now under the existing legislation for the whole of the UK. We don't have the changed Scottish GRC system, and yet Lady Haldane indeed has supported the view that I have taken for many years, that the Equality Act does not refer just to biological sex. There is some sense of maleness or femaleness which the Equality Act deals with, which is not tied to biological sex.
Is that the problem, Sarah, that the Equality Act isn't clear?
Yes, definitely. I take the view that Robin takes, and I was surprised to find myself in a minority when the Haldane judgment came out. I said, but surely the Gender Recognition Act, there's no other interpretation looking at Section 9 other than legal sex comes under the umbrella of sex, so you've now got legal and biological. The problem, though, is I don't agree with Robin at all that these are small changes. For a start, it's going down to age 16, 17. As Michael Foran pointed out in his very clear piece of the 6 significant changes to the Equality Act, that's a biggie, because suddenly now schools are going to have to grapple with the impact of that. It's just not right to say these are small changes, because clearly the bill is designed to enlarge the cohort of people who will be able to get a GRC, because the requirement of a diagnosis of gender dysphoria goes.
But is it the case that acquiring a GRC may not increase the likelihood that people will go into female-only spaces?
I think the confusion around the law is definitely going to be a problem. And we know we've got confusion because on the one hand, we've got Lord Hope, a former Supreme Court judge, saying, I think the government were absolutely right to invoke Section 35. We've got Charlie Faulkner, a former Lord Chancellor, going, they're absolutely wrong. The key for me is, do women have a right to single-sex female spaces? And if you think they don't, then explain why. And what's happening now is, quite deliberately from some quarters, that issue is being confused and obfuscated. And this process doesn't help.
Well, let's talk about that issue. Robin, can I put that question to you? Do women have a right to single-sex spaces?
Well, not under the law as it stands. That's not the structure of the Equality Act. The Equality Act makes provision for single-sex spaces, and that's the gatekeepers of that are the providers. So I have, for example, 2 rape crisis centres as clients, one in Edinburgh, one in Brighton. And they are the experts in providing that sort of service, and they are trans-inclusive services. Now, they're entitled to make different choices, but they don't.
But is it possible that with the changes, or with the ambiguity over what is meant in the Equality Act in terms of sex, that if, for instance, a rape crisis centre was set up, but it says it will only be for biological males and trans-identified people won't be admitted, would that be something you would object to?
Well, it's not something I have a view on, in a sense, in that the Act provides that opportunity. Now, it's not an absolute opportunity for the service provider, because it has to be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. So the service provider, I don't know, couldn't say that the maintenance person has to be female because they're not interacting perhaps with the users of the service. But the people who run the service could decide, as some services have, to provide the service on a trans-exclusive basis. And if they can show that that's a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, then they act legally.
So is there a problem here, Sarah, insofar as the Act in itself, the Scottish Bill, won't really change that much on the practical level? People are concerned about these single-sex spaces. But actually, will this legislation make really that much of a difference if, for instance, rape crisis centres can say, we are exclusively female?
I say that it will, because the express purpose is to increase the cohort of people who will acquire a gender recognition certificate. As the government said in its reasons for invoking Section 35, all safeguards have been removed. The government is not convinced that there are appropriate safeguards now for women and girls. And I note Robin shaking Robin's head. Now, I think about a year ago, Robin, we met on a Zoom for equality and diversity for students. And you said during that Zoom that women who say there is a clash between trans rights and women's rights are, and I quote, completely mad. Are you still of that view?
I think the focus, so at the moment we have a focus on the Scottish Bill. The Scottish Bill does very limited things. Yes, it increases the cohort. There are thought to be 25 to 30 GRCs being granted in Scotland each year at the moment. That may rise to 200 or 300, but set against the population, it's still tiny, tiny numbers. And a really important point is that our combating violence against women and girls is really important. And if we focus on an irrelevance, which is the trans issue related to that, and it is an irrelevance, then we run the great risk of not focusing on those predatory males who are really the risk, both to natal females and trans females.
Can I ask you a bit more about that, Robin? Because you say that it's an irrelevance, that the fear that certain campaigners have, that self-ID, gender self-ID, could put women at risk.
Yeah.
But there have been cases, haven't there, where people have exploited the notion of self-ID in order to commit acts of violence against women.
I listened to a Cure's show yesterday when preparing to come on, and she postulated a circumstance where a predatory male presents themselves as female to access a female space. Now, okay, we have 350 million people living under self-ID systems at the moment, and I don't think we have instances of that. But just think of the logic of that for a moment. Are they then going to go on and apply to the state for a GRC, and put their hand up effectively and say, look, here I am, call attention to myself, when no one needs a GRC to attend a service. No one needs an altered birth certificate to attend a service.
Do they need a GRC, though, to be transferred to a woman's prison?
No, absolutely not. The pathway is slightly different whether they have one or not, but what the prison service does is it takes a risk-based approach. It looks at the needs of the individual, the needs of the population, and it takes a risk-based approach as to where they're placed on the prison estate.
But mistakes have been made, haven't there, Sarah, in terms of prisons?
Right now, Andrew, right at this minute, a gentleman who now wants to be called Isla is last week undergoing a trial for rape. And his victims were having to, in court, refer to her penis. There's also a man called Caballero who has abducted and raped his female care worker, who's going to be released from prison and wants to be called Claire. There's absolutely no doubt that getting a GRC gives men like this more clout. Now, I completely agree with Robin. The problem is not trans people. The problem is predatory men. But at the moment, we are given no test to show that so-and-so is a true and honest trans person and so-and-so is a predatory male. And removing the requirement for a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria is increasing the risks, as the UK government say.
Am I right in thinking that an amendment was proposed to the Scottish bill that would make it impossible for, say, someone who was on trial for sexual assault to say subsequently, I'm of the
Two
opposite
amendments
sex?
were proposed around sexual offending, and one of them, yes, was anyone who was awaiting trial, there should be a pause on their application to save female victims of male sexual assault from having to refer to their attacker in court as she. Now, if that ever happens to me, and I hope it doesn't, I will go to prison before I will call a male rapist she. This cannot have been the purpose of the Gender Recognition Act. This cannot be where the framers of that act thought we would end up 20 years later.
So, Robin, there's a dispute here about to what extent the Gender Recognition Act will have an impact on whether male sexual offenders can be transferred to women's prison. But do you accept that there is a legitimate concern there, that men will obviously in prison exploit that and to be housed with vulnerable women? That it has happened and it probably will continue to happen.
I haven't seen evidence of that. And the way in which our judges conduct trials in the UK is that there is a thing called the Equal Treatment Bench Book, which judges take their cue from. And that makes very clear that there are certain circumstances where a victim should not be required to refer to an offender in a particular way.
Only after an amendment and after protest from a number of women.
Well,
Maria McLaughlin was caught by the original version of the Equal Treatment Bench Book and was told to refer to the 6-foot man who knocked her to the ground as she.
And we also have Jonathan Mallon, who's this serial rapist. This was reported just 2 days ago. Now says he wants to be called Charlene. He's been bragging to other inmates that he's going to be in a woman's prison by Easter. I mean, these are serious concerns, aren't they?
Yeah, of course they are. And the prison service is the right service to risk assess their needs, the needs of the rest of the prison population, and to safely manage. There's no bar on placing a prisoner either on what is referred to as the male estate or the female estate, depending on what the appropriate safe place for them to be is in the estate. And the prison service is the appropriate service to manage that, properly risk assessed.
Sarah, so Nicola Sturgeon has come in on this. She had an interview the other day and she said the fear that women have about predatory men accessing women-only spaces to abuse and attack women is very real, but you don't have to show your birth certificate to access women-only spaces. So the point is this bill does not give predatory men any more ability to abuse women than that predatory man already has. This seems to be a widely held view, though, doesn't it?
Well, I can only repeat the answer I gave a little while ago. I disagree because there is no test now being offered to us to say this is a true and honest trans woman and this is a predatory male. Removing all safeguards, taking the 2-year period down to 3 months. Look, the UK government has said in terms the reason that Section 35 was invoked the first time ever was because the government was not satisfied that the safeguards in the bill were sufficient for women and girls. We've got the UN rapporteur giving evidence to the Scottish politicians about this, and she seems to have been dismissed and ignored.
Yes.
We've got female politicians being jeered at and intimidated in the House of Commons. We've got Scottish politicians standing in front of placards wielded by men saying, decapitate TERFs. So Nicola Sturgeon needs to wake up. This is a very unpopular bill in her own country and amongst her own politicians.
So, Robin, I've spoken to a lot of feminists who have concerns about this, and none of them have said to me that they feel that trans people are inherently predatory or that there's a connection between being trans and being a predator, but they're concerned about the exploitation. Sarah just raised an interesting issue. How can you be sure that someone who claims to be trans is, or whether they... I mean, how do you validate self-ID is what I'm asking.
Every category of person in society has good people and bad people.
Yes, I think we'd all agree.
In every category. And, a slightly ridiculous analogy is that we all use telephones. Criminals use telephones. But what you don't do is ban telephones because criminals use telephones. What you do is identify wrongful use and look at that and criminalise that.
But the trouble is if people can't... if there's no way to measure self-ID...
Andrew, we're right back to... I've been in practice 30 years. And when I started in practice, Section 28 was in place. And it was still acceptable to say you shouldn't have gay men as primary school teachers because they're after your children. And that connection constantly being made between trans people and criminals or sex offenders or whatever is the thing that winds trans people up. No end. No trans person would say that an offender should not be properly dealt with. No trans person would say that. What we need to focus on is dealing properly with offenders and separately, properly with trans people.
Andrew, can I come in on that? Because
Yes,
it's
of course.
a matter of real bafflement to me that Robin sat throughout Alison Bailey's employment tribunal, because Robin was junior counsel for Stonewall, and heard all of this explained at length and eloquently by Ben Cooper KC. The problem is not trans people. The problem is men. And if you are allowing men an easy route to identify as women, that puts women and girls at risk of harm. That is incontrovertible. So rather than answering that, and I note that Robin never gave an answer to my question, whether Robin was still of the view that I and other women like me are completely mad for having these views. I don't think we are, and Lord Hope doesn't think we are, and the UK government doesn't think we are. But, kudos to Robin for coming and having this debate. I think it is really significant, because this should have been happening 4 or 5 years ago. Glad it's happening now. But unless people are willing to be honest about these central issues and not simply come back with the same tired old tropes of force-teaming transness with sexuality, this isn't Section 28. No gay man has ever wanted to run a race against a woman. No gay man has ever wanted to go into a woman's refuge. It's a completely false and unhelpful analogy. And if it winds trans people up, I'm sorry, the answer is for trans people to engage honestly with what is a real concern. I'm not making this up for thrills. I'm not a bigot spouting hate. I'm very, very worried about women and girls, and people need to engage with that.
So it's about minorities, isn't it? I suppose a similar analogy might be that with schools, we have disclosure and barring service checks for everyone, all teachers, because there might be a tiny minority who will be wanting to gain access to vulnerable children. Yeah. But what those checks are not implying is that teachers are inherently, have a predilection towards predatory behaviour. And similarly, no one is saying, or at least Sarah certainly is not saying, that trans people are inherently predatory. But there is a minority of men who will exploit the system. Is that not a fair point? And how is that anti-trans, in your view?
It's not anti-trans per se, but, for example, some of the proposals in Scotland, and I sat in the Scottish Parliament all the way through the debates. What the Scottish Government have done is add into offender legislation in Scotland some protections, and some protections against sex offenders being able to gain some of the advantages of a gender recognition certificate in Scotland. And that's exactly how it should be dealt with, that the protections should relate to the wrongdoers and not the generality of the population or the generality of the trans population.
But I suppose the counter-argument is that you just need to, that the law when it comes to prisons and spaces just needs to focus on biology, but that you give people the right to identify however they want in every other walk of life. I mean, that seems like a reasonable compromise, isn't it?
But we've identified at the start of the discussion that the sex, effectively, as measured by the Equality Act, is not biological. So trans people's sex is not founded in biology. It's founded in their innate sense of self. So that doesn't work.
Well, I disagree with that. The Sex and Equality Act, as I understand it, is quite clearly biological sex and legal sex. Legal sex doesn't automatically override biological sex. And that, I think your compromise makes perfect sense. As I said before, sex is often irrelevant in most day-to-day interactions, but when it matters, it really, really matters. And I note, for example, Robin has said that Robin did not make any changes to Robin's voice because Robin wanted to retain that male privilege of a deeper voice in an advocacy setting. Now, that's not something
Sarah,
that's available
I'm really sorry,
to
but
women.
that's a complete misrepresentation of anything I've said.
Right. Well, I apologise if so. That's what I'd heard and understood you to be saying, that you didn't choose to feminise your voice. Because the deeper voice...
And you have to be able to come back on...
I will.
Yeah. No, if that's wrong, then
It's
of course...
completely wrong.
I will retract and apologise. But it does underscore my point that sex, when it matters, is not something that I, as a woman, can identify out of. I'm stuck with it and all the consequences it has for my body and my vulnerability when faced with a man.
Well, this is obviously a very difficult issue, but we are out of time, but I would like to thank you both very much for coming on.
Can I answer the voice point?
Absolutely,
please?
of course, yes. It's important that you do that, yeah.
Right. So what I said was that, what I remember saying was that my voice is my voice, and there are surgical techniques which can alter a voice. As an oral advocate, it's my speaking tool, and there are great risks in terms of going down the surgical route to alter a voice. And that's why I've chosen not to do that, and why on occasion still I get misgendered when I phone up my hotel. There are wonderful female advocates with appropriate female voices. Sarah, no doubt, is one. I wish I had a different voice. I wish I had had the opportunity that young people have these days to go through what I would have regarded as the right puberty and not have my voice broadened and deepened when it did, which was part of the awful experience that trans people have when they go through what they regard for themselves as the wrong puberty. Now, what I did not say ever was that I retain the speaking voice that I have because it retains male privilege. If I could have an appropriate female speaking voice, if you could snap your fingers and do that for me, Andrew, I would be delighted.
Okay. Well, I think the point has been clarified, and I think that's absolutely fair. And I would like to thank you both for coming on to talk about this, and I hope we can do this again, because I think there are so many issues relating to this that we just don't get to talk about ever because it just doesn't happen. So I do really appreciate your participation. Thank you to Sarah and Robin. And after the break on Free Speech Nation, we're going to be talking about the British government plans to ban trans conversion.